Today, the spotlight focuses on government, its evolution and revelation. The word evolution appears in the Urantia book 441 times. Our planet is in the process of evolving. Humans are evolving, human society is evolving, and likewise, human government is evolving. Joyce and I are going to address what the Urantia book reveals about government, including human government's beginnings, its current status, and its destiny. Our presentation, we're going to start by touching on celestial government, and then we're going to turn to the evolution of human government, the development of the state, government on a neighboring planet, and we'll conclude with the Urmia lectures. A point we'd like you to take away, and that we'll make repeatedly during our presentation, is that true sovereignty exists at just two levels: the individual level and the global level, the sovereignty of humankind. Everything in between these two levels is temporary scaffolding. Remember that government on Urantia is still evolving. Nationalism, our current situation, doesn't represent true sovereignty. It's simply an evolutionary stepping stone to global government.
So we'll talk about celestial government at three levels: the central universe, the super universe, and the local universe. Concerning the government of the central universe, there is none. There is simply no need of government among such perfect and near perfect intelligences.
Turning to the super government. Super government is spiritual government at its highest. It governs everything below the central universe and everything above the local universe. Our super universe is longtime. Its capital is UBIS. It consists of 10 major sectors and 1,000 minor sectors. And super universe government exists at each sector level. And at each sector level governs matters appropriate to that level. To understand the super universe government, you have to grasp its magnitude. Our super universe, serves descending beings from the central universe and the trillions upon trillions of ascending beings from the local universes who are working their way through the super universe to eventually end up in the central universe. Our super universe consists of 100,000 local universes and 1 trillion inhabitable planets.
Our super universe government has three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. And this is the same as on our local universe and in general, mostly on our planet. Now, this actually is a divine concept. In fact, the only sacred feature of any human government is this division into three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. With respect to the government of our local universe of Nebadon, the sovereign sons of the local universes are supreme in their own domains. They are subject to super government only insofar as they voluntarily submit matters for counsel or adjudication to the Ancients of Days. Now, there are exceptions. Nebadon courts cannot resolve cases involving questions of eternal life and death. These decisions are made by the Ancients of Days. They cannot address default or defection of any local universe sons of God, such as Lucifer or Caligastia. They can't rule on readmission of any part of a local universe to full spiritual status, such as after quarantine following rebellion.
There are three levels of celestial government at the local universe level. Each local universe consists of 100 constellations and 10 million inhabitable planets. Each constellation consists of 100 systems and 100,000 inhabitable planets. And a system consists of 1,000 inhabitable planets. And there is government at each one of these levels. Generally, the universe rulers are concerned with the spiritual status of the realms. Recall that Christ Michael, when he was here on Urantia, was chiefly concerned with the spiritual status of Urantia. Probably better to say exclusively concerned with it. The rulers at the constellation are chiefly concerned with social and governmental conditions prevailing on the planets and systems. Recall that the Most Highs of Urantia rule in the kingdoms of men. And the system rulers are chiefly concerned with the welfare of their planets, particularly the physical status of living beings with biologic problems.
So now let's turn to the evolution of human government. Government evolves by trial and error. Anarchy augmented misery. Therefore, government, which is comparative law and order, slowly emerged or is emerging. This slide lists the section headings of paper 70, Evolution of Human Government, which show its development starting with war and working its way through the progressive elements and steps that help us organize and create government.
The revelators tell us that war is a natural state and heritage of evolving man. In contrast, peace is a social yardstick measuring civilization's advance. War is an animalistic reaction to misunderstandings and irritations. Peace attends upon civilized solution of all such problems and difficulty. We're told that warfare persists because man is human, evolved from an animal, and animals are bellicose. The life and death struggle of war was a mighty motivator for lazy mankind. In past ages, a fierce war would institute social changes and facilitate the adoption of new ideas, such as would not have occurred naturally in 10,000 years. War has had an evolutionary and selective value, but like slavery, it must be abandoned as a civilization slowly advances. War has been an indispensable scaffolding in the building of civilization, but today has become incapable of producing dividends of social gain in any way commensurate with its costs. Joyce, in your opinion, was slavery a major evolutionary advance?
Well, as abhorrent as we find slavery today, it actually was a step forward. The prior condition was that if one tribe defeated another tribe in battle, they slaughtered them, all of them, men, women, and children. And so it's actually a step forward to enslave a population, keep them part of the population, and then they can be part of society moving forward.
In addition to that, not only did slavery save lives of the defeated people, but it also provided a source of labor, freeing up the conquerors to work on other evolutionary pursuits.
Exactly.
But like war, the revelators compare war to slavery, and slavery is something which we rightfully put in humankind's rearview mirror. And war, they're telling us, is something we should do likewise.
Absolutely. But here's the thing about war. Man will never accept peace as a normal mode of living until he has been thoroughly and repeatedly convinced that peace is best for his material warfare. We see examples of this today with Russia's ongoing war with Ukraine, the recent invasion of the Democratic Republic of the Congo by Rwanda, and the Israel-Hamas war. So now let's look at early human associations. Families were united by blood ties. Subsequently, these evolved into tribes or territorial communities. Warfare and external pressure forced the tribal organization upon kinship clans, but it was commerce and trade that held these early and primitive groups together with some degree of internal peace.
Joyce, to what extent does commerce and trade still promote peace today?
Well, think of multinational companies. My employer has employees and facilities in dozens of countries. We sell products in dozens more, and we need peace to serve our customers.
Does trade build friendships and bridges among nations?
Absolutely. It builds bridges across previously antagonistic peoples. And today, when I hear of a disaster or accident somewhere in the world, I think, oh, I know someone there. I hope they're okay. And this brings the world closer.
The first peace group was the family, then the clan, the tribe, and later on the nation. Civil government is a product of progressive evolution, just as marriage, industry, and religion. From the early clans and primitive tribes, they're gradually developed the successive orders of human government. Not surprisingly, the first real governmental body was the Council of Elders.
Blood kinship determined the first social groups. Intermarriage was the next step, and the resultant complex tribe was the first true political body. So now that we have a society, let's look at social classes within society. The Revelators state that the mental and physical inequality of human beings ensures that social classes will appear. The only worlds without social strata are the most primitive and the most advanced. A dawning civilization has not yet begun the differentiation of social levels, while the world settled in light and life has largely effaced these divisions of mankind.
Flexible and shifting classes are indispensable to an evolving civilization. But the Revelators warn that when a class becomes a caste, society experiences sharply curtailed individual development and failure of social cooperation. They tell us that classes in society will persist until man gradually achieves their evolutionary obliteration. Joyce, in your opinion, what role does upward class mobility play in a civilization?
Well, it gives people options and freedom. You don't have to be a barrel maker simply because your father was a barrel maker. And if in fact you would be a better blacksmith, it's better for society that you can be a blacksmith.
And also, wouldn't you agree that if opportunities exist within the existing system, that it lessens the need for revolution?
Right. These are like pressure valves. People can find the right place for them.
The Revelators tell us that nature confers no rights on man. Nature doesn't even confer the right to live. They give us an amusing illustration and ask what would likely happen if an unarmed man met a hungry tiger face to face in the primitive forest. Then they tell us that society's prime gift to man is security. You know, we take security for granted today. But for our predecessors, security meant the difference between life and death. Human rights are not really natural. They're entirely social. They're relative and just ever-changing rules of the game. So Joyce, without society, human rights wouldn't exist.
That's correct. And if we look to the past, we see that few human rights were recognized in the European Middle Ages. Then every man belonged to someone else. Rights were only privileges or favors granted by the state or church. And the revolt from this error was equally erroneous in that it led to the belief that all men are born equal.
Stay there for a second, Joyce. I'm going to focus on that second phrase. Then every man belonged to someone else. So every person in the Middle Ages either belonged to the state or the king or to the church.
That's correct. And the Pope was answerable to God. So everyone was answerable to someone.
Or owned by somebody.
Owned by someone, yes. But this equality ideal is the child of civilization. It is not found in nature. Society cannot offer equal rights to all, but it can promise to administer the varying rights of each with fairness and equity.
And hence the reference to the 14th Amendment.
Right, equal protection under the law.
Natural justice is a man-made theory. It's not a reality. It's a pure fiction. Nature provides but one kind of justice. Inevitable conformity of results to causes. What happens in a drought? Crops fail. Society early adopted the paying back attitude of retaliation. An eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. The evolving tribes all recognized this right of blood vengeance. Joyce, was the eye for an eye concept of justice a major evolutionary advance?
Well, actually it was. An eye for an eye demonstrates proportionality. If you put out my brother's eye, I no longer think it's right to kill you and your brother.
Did the ancients consider motive in their eye for an eye concept of justice?
No, they didn't. Whereas that's something we recognize. We think that if I cause someone's death while driving in a car and having an accident, that's somewhat different than if I go out and plan and commit premeditated murder.
Justice was first meted out by the family, then the clan, and later on by the tribe. The Revelators tell us that the administration of true justice dates from the taking of revenge from private and kin groups and lodging it in the hands of the state. Joyce, why is it so important to place justice in the hands of the state?
Well, if we think about vigilantism and lynch mobs and the injustices they cause, that's an example of people privately trying to administer consequences. We believe that the best results come with an impartial judge or trier of facts. and with time to reflect.
And when all the facts have actually come to light, not in the heat of the moment.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So now let's turn to laws and courts. Law is a codified record of long human experience. It's public opinion crystallized and legalized. Law is always at first negative and prohibitive. Thou shalt not kill. Every grant of rights or liberty to the individual involves curtailment of the liberties of all others. My rights end where yours begin. So now let's address the development of the state. The state represents society's net gain from the ravages and sufferings of war. The modern state is the institution which survived in the long struggle for group power, but it is not of divine genesis. It is purely an evolutionary institution.
The embryonic state was made possible by the decline of the blood bond in favor of the territorial. And such tribal federations were usually firmly cemented by conquest. While a sovereignty that transcends all minor struggles and group differences is characteristic of the true state, still, many classes and castes persist in the state organizations as remnants of clans and tribes of former days. And this is still true today. Although democracy is ideal, the revelators warn, go slowly, select carefully. For the dangers of democracy are glorification of mediocrity, choice of base and ignorant rulers, failure to recognize the basic facts of social evolution, the danger of universal suffrage in the hands of the uneducated and indolent majorities, and slavery to public opinion. They tell us the majority is not always right.
The measure of the advance of society is directly determined by the degree to which public opinion can control personal behavior and state regulation through nonviolent expression. This means that members of a society have agreed on a system to decide things. Popular elections may not always decide things rightly, but they represent the right way even to do a wrong thing. Evolution does not at once produce superlative perfection, but rather comparative and advancing practical adjustment.
Joyce, I seem to recall a similar quote.
Yes, evolution may be slow, but it is terribly effective.
And it's God's plan.
Absolutely. So as we look at the ideals of statehood, remember that survival of democracy depends on the practice of electing to public office. Only those individuals who are technically trained, intellectually competent, socially loyal, and morally fit. It is not what a state is, but what it does that determines the course of social evolution. No state can transcend the moral values of its citizenry, as exemplified in their chosen leaders. Ignorance and selfishness will ensure the downfall of even the highest type of government.
The revelators tell us that no society has progressed very far when it permits idleness or tolerates poverty. They also state that poverty and dependence can never be eliminated if the defective and degenerative stocks are freely supported and permitted to reproduce without restraint. A moral society should aim to preserve the self-respect of its citizenry and afford every normal individual adequate opportunity for self-realization. Such a plan of social achievement would yield a cultural society of the highest order. Social evolution should be encouraged. But how do we do that? By governmental supervision, which exercises a minimum of regulative control. That state is best, which coordinates most while governing the least. Joyce, do parallels exist in child rearing and business?
Well, I think they do. As an example, when you have young children, you need to provide them a safe environment in which they can grow and develop. You have to make sure they're protected from dangers that they don't understand. And similarly with employees, we need to ensure that they have adequate training and the tools to do their job, but then we want to ensure that they have the freedom to make continuous improvements and own the process and continue to grow and develop themselves.
So if we want our children to grow we're not helicopter parents.
Right.
And if you want your employees to grow, you're not micromanaging them.
Exactly.
So if you want your society to grow as a government, you're not over-governing them.
Absolutely right. But it's difficult to get that balance. UB tells us that the business of governing cities and provinces should be conducted by experts and managed just as are all other forms of economic and commercial associations with people. Now, that's not always our current approach.
You know, we're going to revisit this government should be conducted by principle again in our discussion of government on a neighboring planet.
That's absolutely right. So more to come on this important point. So as we look at progressive civilization, we note that progress in the arts of civilization leads directly to the realization of the highest human and divine goals, and that is the achievement of the brotherhood of man and the personal status of God consciousness.
The Revelators state that one of the greatest peace moves of all time has been the attempt to separate church and state. But they also warn that progress in the evolution of human society is tied to God consciousness. Without God, without religion, humankind can never coordinate its forces, harmonize its divergent and rivalrous interests, races, and nationalisms. You simply cannot establish the brotherhood of men while ignoring or denying the fatherhood of God. Without God, neither freedom and liberty nor property and wealth will lead to peace. Now we're going to turn to one of the more interesting papers in the Urantia book, Government on a Neighboring Planet. You know, before we start, let me caveat this by saying that the government that we're going to talk about on our neighboring planet is just the government of just one continent on that planet, right? And the other governments on that planet aren't nearly as advanced. We're going to explore what prompted the Revelators to seek permission to reveal our neighboring planet's affairs. We're going to explore government practices on our neighboring planet. And as we do so, I'd like you to consider how such practices might advance civilization on Urantia.
It is most unusual for the system rulers to consent to the narration on one planet of the affairs on another. So why make an exception here? As the Revelators tell us, this recital of the affairs of a neighboring planet is made by special permission with the intent of advancing civilization and augmenting governmental evolution on Urantia. Now, the neighboring planet has a history similar to ours. Like ours, their planetary prince defaulted. Like ours, their material sun defaulted. And the timeline is similar. Their material sun arrived soon after ours did. So now let's look at these identical twin sisters on the right. Undoubtedly, they have had some varied experiences over the course of their life, but we'd expect the outcomes to be pretty similar.
And we'd expect the outcomes to be pretty similar on this continent to what we have here at Urantia.
Right.
So is their government superior? Well, consider they have no prisons or hospitals for the insane, 90% fewer criminals, defective and insane persons, a 99% lower homicide rate, a 90% smaller police force, a 90% lower divorce rate. And I might add, the average lifespan is 90 years, which is 15% higher than the other nations on that planet and 15% higher than the life expectancy here in the United States. All right. We're going to address our neighboring planet's political organization, its education system, its prerequisites for marriage, its voting requirements, and how they handle crime and insanity.
So the particular country that we're talking about, they have three branches of their government: executive, legislative, and judicial, as do we. But as a difference to ours, all of their leaders are professionally trained. They are required to be graduates of schools of statesmanship, and they maintain these schools of statesmanship at the national, regional, and state levels.
Joyce, what do you think might be taught in these schools of statesmanship?
Well, I suspect a lot of history so that they understand what has worked well and has not worked well in the past. I think there would be a lot of technical training. They should learn negotiating techniques, collaboration, team building, diplomacy. leadership. And I think also there should be a focus probably on the privilege of service, because that's something that clearly comes out about how they view serving in office.
And how do you think this would work out in our government?
I think it would absolutely benefit our society if we had this type of training available to our leaders.
It is available, it's just not required.
Well, it's not mandatory, correct. They have a chief executive who serves a single term of 6 years, but is permitted to run for a second time on approval of 75% of the legislature. Now, another difference from our system, they have a council of former chief executives who advises the current chief executive.
And if that were to happen in the United States, for example, all the living presidents would be a council who would advise our existing president.
Absolutely.
And when he'd run his term, then he would be on that council advising the next president.
Correct. So as we turn to the legislature, they have an upper house and lower house, as do we, but their upper house is elected by economic function and their lower house is elected by social function, as compared to the geographic regions that we use. Now, a difference here is that they have a third house, an advisory house, composed of elder statesmen, 100 who serve for life.
Now, Joyce, it appears that our neighboring planet's intent is to capitalize on leadership and experience.
Well, they clearly respect expertise and experience and want to ensure that it has a place in their government.
The education system on our neighboring planet is similar to ours. They have compulsory education for ages 5 to 18, at least a month-long vacation, and college after 18. Where they differ is that their goal is to make every pupil self-supporting. Joyce, how does being self-supporting relate to self-respect?
Well, if you can support yourself, you're not dependent on anyone, and this fosters self-respect.
They have no classrooms in their schools. They study only one topic at a time, which means they may study a certain element of agriculture for 3 months. All pupils become assistant teachers, meaning that once they learn something, they turn around and teach it to the students right behind them. What does teaching something to others do for you?
Well, in order to be able to teach something to someone, you need to fully understand it. You have to refine your own understanding.
In fact, they say that you don't understand something until you've actually taught it to someone else.
That's correct. And if you have a nation of teachers, they can share information and wisdom more effectively.
And each student becomes experienced at teaching the people right behind them, teaching others. So that so what you have is really a community of people who know how to teach.
Absolutely.
And have had success at it, to a certain degree of success. Their schools are heavily vocational until college, and they devote 25% of their time to play so that the youths don't become bored.
Well, and I thought it was so that they could burn off their excess energy, but difference of opinion.
Turning to marriage. On our neighboring planet, you're not allowed to marry before age 20, and you're permitted to marry between ages 20 and 24 only with parental consent. You have to file a 1-year notice of intent to marry.
So no Vegas marriages.
Right. And you also have to obtain a certificate of instruction from the parental schools showing that you understand marriage responsibility. And this is true of both the bride and the groom.
So how do these policies play out? Let's look at how divorce is experienced there. In the US in 2022, 40 to 50% of first marriages and 60 to 67% of second marriages ended in divorce, as compared to 4 to 5% of first marriages and 6 to 7% of second marriages on the neighboring planet. We know that divorce often results in single parent families, and that this can hurt children in many ways, both short-term and long-term, including as they try to form pair bonds and families of their own.
Joyce, how would it affect our society if 95% of our marriages succeeded?
Well, I think you would have stronger families. You would have fewer children experiencing the trauma of perhaps not having one parent in their lives, and the families themselves would be stronger building blocks of society.
Yeah, and the basic building block of society or government is the family, right?
Absolutely.
So if we have stronger families, we're going to have a stronger society and also stronger government.
Correct. So now let's look at suffrage. On the neighboring planet, they reject one man, one vote rule, except in electing the chief executive. For other elective offices, they allow up to 9 extra votes, and they confer these extra votes to individuals who have rendered great service to society, to those who have demonstrated extraordinary wisdom in government service, to scientists, inventors, teachers, philosophers, spiritual leaders, and heavy taxpayers.
Awarding extra votes serves as reward for significant contributions to society and puts more voting power in the hands of society's most experienced and capable voters.
That's right.
On our neighboring planet, voting is compulsory. In the United States, in our last presidential election, we had a 64% turnout. There are exceptions. They don't allow government servants supported by tax dollars to vote for the period of such service. Joyce, you think that's due to apparent conflicts of interest?
That seems pretty clear, yes.
And they're not going to allow individuals who have been determined in a hearing in state court to be defective, idle, indifferent, or criminal to vote. The revelators tell us that these people recognize that when 50% of a nation is inferior or defective and possesses the ballot, such a nation is doomed. They believe the dominance of mediocrity spells the downfall of any nation. Turning to how they deal with crime, ordinary criminals and defectives are placed by sex in different agricultural colonies. This is an effort to prevent the breeding of criminals and defectives, and it began over 100 years ago. The more serious criminals and the incurably insane are promptly sentenced to death in the gas chambers. Pretty harsh.
Well, the revelators predict that our neighboring planet's methods of dealing with crime, insanity, and degeneracy will prove shocking to most Urantians. But the results are compelling. The homicide rate is 1% of other nations on the planet. They have no prisons or hospitals for the insane. Their criminal and insane populations are 10% of ours, and their police force is 10% of what it was only 50 years ago.
And that due to breeding restrictions, that's a characterization by the revelators, right?
Yes, yes.
Not ours.
Correct. So what would it mean to reduce the US homicide rate by 99%? In 2022, we had over 21,000 homicides. What would it mean to reduce the US prison population by 90%? In 2022, we had over 1.2 million prisoners. How would a 99% drop in homicide and a 90% drop in serious crime increase the quality of life in our poorer neighborhoods? We know that poor communities bear the brunt of serious crime. How many fewer families would experience the loss of a family member to murder or become victims of other violent crimes themselves? It could be transformative.
Now we're going to turn to the final segment of our presentation, the Urantia Lectures. We're going to focus on the need for global government. Christ Michael rarely spoke on matters of government or social matters. In fact, he deliberately refrained and refused to do so. The Urantia Lectures marked the one time where Christ Michael did speak, and he spoke at length about government and social matters. At Urantia, there's a renowned school of religious philosophy, and that's where Jesus gave his lectures. He was leading a camel caravan to the Caspian Sea, and on the way out, he stopped at this religious school and agreed on his return to give 24 lectures on the brotherhood of man. These lectures were in reality on the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of men. His lectures have been adapted to 20th century religious and political views by the revelators.
At Urantia, Jesus addressed the need for a global government and made 3 points. War will continue until Urantia adopts a world government. The problem is nationalism, and internationalism cannot stop war. As Dave noted at the outset, there are only 2 levels of relative sovereignty on an inhabited world: the spiritual free will of the individual and the collective sovereignty of mankind as a whole.
There are just 2 levels of sovereignty: the individual and the world as a whole, and everything in between is temporary. Temporary levels of sovereignty include families, clans, tribal units, political groupings, and nations. Political sovereignty evolves through a surrender of self-determinism, first by the individual within the family, and then by families and clans in relation to the tribe and larger groupings. Throughout the history of our planet, there's been a progressive transfer of self-determination from the smaller to ever larger political organizations. According to Jesus, the problem today is nationalism. You cannot prevent nations from going to war as long as they remain infected with the delusional virus of national sovereignty. War is not man's great and terrible disease. War is merely a symptom, a result. The real disease is the virus of national sovereignty.
When nations are few, strong, and powerful, the stage is set for major wars, worldwide conflicts. So-called sovereign nations cannot rub elbows without generating conflicts and eventuating wars. Jesus asserted that war will continue until Urantia evolves a global government. Peace will not come to Urantia until every so-called sovereign nation surrenders its power to make war into the hands of a representative government of all mankind. Moreover, global wars will go on until the government of mankind is created. Global sovereignty will prevent global wars. Nothing else can.
The revelators warn that war will become ever more destructive. With scientific progress, wars are going to become more and more devastating until they become, in the revelators' words, almost racially suicidal. The revelators ask, how many world wars must be fought and how many leagues of nations must fail before men will be willing to establish the government of mankind and begin to enjoy the blessings of permanent peace? Political sovereignty on Urantia has evolved from the family to clans to nations. We must now evolve from many nations into one world government. The difficulty in the evolution of political sovereignty from the family to mankind lies in the resistance exhibited on all intervening levels. Each new and forward evolution of political sovereignty is hampered by the scaffolding stages of the previous developments in political organization. The Urantia nations will not easily relinquish their independence to a world government. Human loyalties, once mobilized, are hard to change. The pride which made the nation possible, for example, the United States, now impedes the evolution of a global government.
To understand why nationalism persists, let's turn to Machiavelli's The Prince. He noted, it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things, because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents, who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men, who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience of them. And this is as true today as it was 500 years ago when Machiavelli made these observations.
Hold on a second. Joyce, unfortunately, few people today are even discussing global government. The need for global government is on almost no one's radar, right?
That's right. And that's one of the reasons we're talking about this today.
And in addition to the fact that the Urantia book goes on quite a bit about it.
Absolutely. So to illustrate how a global government might work, the revelators point to the US. Each of the 50 states has surrendered its sovereignty and right of self-determination to the federal government. As a result, all 50 states enjoy interstate peace. New York is not invading Pennsylvania. In a similar manner, the nations of the world will enjoy peace when they each surrender their sovereignty and self-determination to a global government.
Internationalism is a step forward. It's wonderful when countries can work together to resolve collective problems. But the revelators warn that internationalism is just temporary scaffolding. Internationalism will not and is not preventing major conflicts on Urantia. Open war exists in Ukraine and Israel. The major powers of Russia and China are squaring off against the United States and Western Europe. In a land grab, China is preparing to invade and conquer Taiwan. Internationalism is effective, but only to a point. It relies on cooperation rather than the rule of law. What happens when a nation decides not to cooperate? What recourse exists? Internationalism can't prevent nations from going to war, committing atrocities, polluting, ignoring climate change, encouraging terrorism, and plotting against their neighbors. Only a global government will have such power.
But what can we do to bring about a global government? Urantia will someday evolve a true global government. Nations like the US, China, and Russia will either voluntarily relinquish their sovereignty and right of self-determination to a world government, or be forced to do so by a world war so horrible that humanity is compelled to create a global government to prevent the possibility of yet another world war. I opt for the voluntary route, but how do we get nations like the US, China, and Russia to cede their national sovereignty and right of self-determination to a global government? First, we must help others understand that internationalism cannot prevent devastating wars. The belief that more internationalism is the answer keeps us from focusing on the real answer, a true world government. Large nations simply will not abandon their sovereignty and right of self-determination so long as they believe a viable alternative exists. Second, we must do a better job of pointing out how a global government will benefit everyone. Urantia faces serious global challenges that demand a united global response, united effort of the type that only a global government can provide. These serious global challenges include climate change,
Global health crises,
cybersecurity threats,
depletion of natural resources,
terrorism,
transnational crimes such as human trafficking,
biodiversity loss,
global economic stability,
migration and refugee issues,
food security,
ocean pollution and conservation,
nuclear disarmament,
space exploration and security.
We've identified many of the areas in which a global government will benefit everyone. We've discussed from climate change to space exploration and security.
We need to help others understand the need for global government. We owe it to humanity and our children to rid Urantia of war and rumors of war, and to equip our planet to handle its myriad global challenges.
In conclusion, to review, we've touched on celestial government. We've examined the evolution of human government, the development of the state. We talked about government on a neighboring planet. And then we just discussed the Urmia lectures, Jesus on sovereignty. One thought we'd like you to take with you from our presentation is that true sovereignty exists at just two levels, the individual level and the global level, the sovereignty of humankind as a whole. Everything in between the individual level and the global level is temporary scaffolding. Our government on Urantia is still evolving. Nationalism, the current state, doesn't represent true sovereignty. Nationalism is merely an evolutionary step to global government. On behalf of Joyce and myself, we'd like to thank you for your attention, and thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce and David. Great presentation. Really just a wonderful job of putting together and giving us all the pieces really of the different expositions of government in various forms, right? Both celestial, the history on our planet, the example of the other planet, and what we might be for the future. So a great topic. I'm sure people have thoughts or questions. Mike, how you doing?
So for those of you that don't know, I still teach part-time at a community college, and I teach an ethics class. And towards the end of it, we start looking at the whole global economy. Fairness, justice is the approach, from an ethical point of view. And what I notice, because I get into this, why doesn't Indiana declare war on Illinois, because we're in the Midwest when there's a dispute, and we get into this whole idea because they gave up their sovereignty. And so this leads to then the idea, which I present, of the world government. But what I can see in some students is this knee-jerk reaction among those who are more, Christian religious fundamentalists, because there's apparently something that they believe that comes from, they think, the book of Revelation in the Bible, that associates the idea of a world government with an antichrist. And this whole thing is a huge barrier for those who have that kind of religious belief. And so I just point that out as another of those unfortunate barriers that even religious beliefs have been associated with political, beliefs in this case, and that further retards people opening up to the idea of this world government.
Well, and I can say also, and I've never had that conversation with anyone raising Revelation as a reason against it, but a lot of our friends who are rather, liberal folks and not religious just look at us like we have two heads when we mention a global government. Because their experience has been living in the US or living in Western Europe at a time when these countries were in the ascendant, and they don't trust, let's say, Russia or China. And so to your point, right, people learn certain things, and we're used to what we're used to. We can't see the benefits necessarily of moving to the next step, but we can see what we'll lose, what we think we'll lose by giving up the American century, as it were.
Yeah, they can't see outside the box. They have a very limited conceptual frame of reference, and they can't even conceive what a global government might look like or the benefits which we might achieve. And unlike your class where you're leading it, we just lose the conversation because it's just so far outside the scope of anything they've ever thought about. And they have all kinds of reasons why it won't succeed.
But we keep bringing it up, so people keep getting used to the idea.
Normalizing it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. And I really like you put the Machiavelli quote in there and when you think about it, part of the problem is there obviously hasn't been a global government. There have been parts like the United States, obviously, as an example, EU as an example. There have been pieces of, where there has been some surrendering of sovereignty, but those haven't been linear, great, smooth paths. I mean, we had a civil war. The EU has, kind of taken 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's just in the nature of everything. So it's very hard to just say, well, let's do like this, because there are so few, examples, and people don't trust it. And when you think about the conditions that had to be there to get the states here to agree to it, to get the European nations to agree to what they've done, it doesn't work with, for instance, it doesn't seem like it would work on the neighboring planet with the evolved nation and the other nations, right? So all good food for thought, but I'll try and stop talking. Les, you were next.
In addition to what Mike brought up as an impediment to the whole concept of the Antichrist and the fear and the distrust of that. In addition is the fear and the distrust with this image of one all-powerful entity just dominating everybody else. And because I think right now the image of government is one that is very extractive and very very, very much about, yeah, just domination while in usurping of freedom and liberty. That is very prevalent in terms of the conceptualizing what a single government planetary entity would operate like. So, which brings just me to think, well, you know, if once we attract more people to the overall teachings of the Urantia book, then that will be the introduction to the concepts of global government that I think people will see the logic of. Right now, this point of history, I mean, even the United Nations, there's with all the good that's done through the NGOs and the interfaith organizations that exist there, they're up against a very big challenge when you have the problem with the United States and one or two other countries just as an obstruction to harmonizing so much of what needs to be harmonized in the planet. So it's definitely a dilemma at this stage in history, and I think it's a great conversation for this community to brainstorm on ways to get through to the people who are just unfortunately seeing the concept of global governance in terms of something to fear and to fight against.
I will point out that we still have local government and regional government and state government. It's just that, like we do in the federal government level, our lives are really determined more by state and local government than it is by the federal government. Federal government handles federal things, state and local government handle local things, and they really control whether or not your local government determines really your lifestyle, you know, with how the speed limit, is it 35 miles an hour, is it 15?
Yeah. It's a bit of a paradox too, right? Because when the US was created, it was created on the premise that, okay, we're going to let you do certain things in the central government, but not everything. Right. EU obviously started with more, okay, let's have a common currency. You know, that sounds good, but then you can grow. So the amalgamations that start by force are ones that have not stuck together, sort of for good reason, right? It was good that the Roman Empire broke up. It was probably good that we don't have a British Empire anymore, even though those were, one could have argued at the time, well, that's on the progression to global government. Not really, right? So it's a paradox, and the time scale is, who knows? Susan.
The problem that really strikes me the most is that China and communism does not believe in God and does not want to give their people that ability. I mean, how do you work with that?
I think you work with it. China would be for example, a state or underneath the global government. And if they don't believe in God, hopefully they'll get the word, but it's not something that would be mandated. You wouldn't have to have that mandate in order to be part of the world government to believe in God. You could still be an atheist or a Urantia book reader, but that's something that does, as you point out, that without God consciousness, there just can't be peace. So it's something you're right, it's something that we need to work on.
Right. Well, they say representative government, right? One can argue that, well, that has to carry down through the individual. You can't just slap a world government on unrepresentative portions and expect it to work. So that's going to require quite a bit of adjustment. David.
You talked about the neighboring planet, and unfortunately for them, they don't have a world government either, and they probably have a harder time than we would, because we have had a master son here and had his guidance to get us at least to where we are now. And in fact, most planets that haven't had rebellion have had a visible planetary government. We have a planetary government, but we can't see it. And we're blessed because we can believe without seeing, but at some point we should have a visible planetary government who can guide us into this next stage of a world government. What do you think?
Well, we're all Agamemnons, right? But that may be slowing down our ability to form a world government because, to Susan's point, right, China doesn't really believe in God to begin with, or at least a lot of folks there don't. I think that's part of the challenge, David, right? That we need to develop a world government, and right now we don't have the normal infrastructure of planets that didn't go through these challenges. But again, the neighboring planet had these challenges too, and they're taking steps.
And they didn't even have, the stole sun that we had. So we should be further ahead than they are. Unfortunately, the revelators think we're not.
Thanks, David. Sandra.
I really feel security is a false perception that we have. And the reason I feel that way, there's many reasons, but this is what I feel is the most valid is I am a Katrina survivor, and I knew a lot of people, friends, family, people I worked with. They all thought they were secure. They had money in the bank, they had insurance, blah, blah, blah. But that notion was quickly squashed. So that's one thing I'd like your thought on. But in closing, I'd like to also say your point on killing somebody in an accident versus premeditated murder brought me to the thought that our consequences, which are very common with the oppressor and have additionally been carried out by the people, are they ever a valid last act?
Responding to your comment about security, I guess we were thinking more of the concept that with early man, right? If you didn't have someone awake at all times, animals would come and eat you, right? You were out there on the plains. So
True.
You build a fire, and then you get dogs and you get other people, and then you're more protected.
And for example, one of the major problems the Urantia book points out was that these agricultural communities, they'd have nomads sweep down and just conquer them and enslave them.
Right.
This is how this planet was built.
Right.
By war, by conqueror, and so it's something to review. But the security is this: we don't have to worry about our lives anymore. In that respect,
In most places,
we can't nature is something that's beyond the security of any government.
Right.
We can't help but if there's a hurricane of, like Katrina, the just outside the scope of any, if you don't, the only way to protect yourself from the dangers of mudslides in California is not to live in California. No government can protect you from that unless they're overly restrictive and don't allow you anywhere near the coast or any place that was a danger of landslides.
I totally agree on that. And I was just using that as an example because there's a lot of other securities that are at risk right now as far as people's jobs, their homes, whether that, all the things you mentioned. But people don't realize how fast that notion of security changes, and it's shocking to the both physically and mentally to people, and that in itself creates a whole nother whirlwind.
Absolutely. And that's why we need effective government with, trained folks who can then, whether it's, disaster relief or whatever is needed in the immediate aftermath.
I think that's why most people or many people think our security is in the Lord. Not
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Our security is in the Lord, and that's the only place it is. And no matter what happens, as long as He's with us, we're fine.
Thank you on that. And your comments on consequences.
Well, look, if you want to look at consequences, look at the French Revolution. I mean, there's an example of some pretty severe consequences.
Right.
And there's, one hopes, and that's we talked about earlier with respect to upward mobility between social classes, the need to overthrow the oppressor It becomes much less when you can be part of the ruling class. And that freedom of mobility, upward mobility, it is seemingly a prerequisite for any type of real governmental stabilization.
Right.
It's not just it's very important on the individual basis that the individual have the ability to move up, because then society takes advantage of the individual's assets, which are really important. But also the fact that without upward mobility, you have a boiling pot. As Joyce said, it relieves pressure and allows civilization to evolve in a more appropriate ways than a devastating revolution, which brings us all back to the Stone Age.
Right. And it's unfortunate that forward movement is often an ugly thing, you know, to get to that point. Thank you again. I appreciate your comments.
Thanks, Sandra. Marion.
Other than barring some unforeseen disastrous catastrophe, do you think that global government, what is your time frame? In my mind, I think it would be like 500 years from now. What do you think on a practical level?
Gosh, that's a good question, Marianne. In fact, I was asking the same question to myself during the run today. Since it's not even on the radar of our planetary leaders or any real groups, it seems to me like we're looking for, and I hate to say this, as the nations become smaller and smaller, like the United States, become fewer and fewer countries grouped in these alliances, the danger of world war, a devastating world war, becomes greater and greater. And so if it's 500 years off, I would be surprised, because I think what's going to happen, more than likely happen, if we don't find a peaceful way to find a global government, is that someone will push the button and then we'll lose. Now, I think we're playing the cross and nothing's really going to happen on this planet. But if we had a terrific World War III, and our 8 billion person population dropped by 3 billion people, because all these people were killed as a result of a war, that would push us into a global government. And would the revelators be sad if we lost 3 billion people and moved into a world government? I'm not so sure they would.
And I think, another way of looking at that, Marion, is if we think back what has happened in the last 100 years. So 1925 to now, right? We've had the Depression, we've had World War II, we've had a whole bunch of other conflicts. We have the UN, we have internationalism. The EU sort of grew and now it's, maybe pulling back a little bit. China is becoming more powerful again. If we, to Dave's point, if we get too far away from remembering how horrible World War II was, I think that's the risk, that then we think, oh, well, we can just get what we want this way or that way. Who would have thought we'd have a land war in Europe, right? But clearly Putin is saying, I can get more by going into the war than I can from peace.
He doesn't believe peace serves his purpose best.
Right. So if we get too far away from these devastating conflicts that we've had, I think people don't study history, they forget, and they start pushing for what they think they can get. And that's why really understanding the risks is so critical. But as to timing, either relatively soon or I think much longer.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Marion. Got a lot of hands up.
No, I haven't heard any mention of AI or the singularity or the potential of artificial intelligence taking over from the whole human decision-making process.
The Urantia book doesn't address artificial intelligence and how we might handle it. And so we really don't have a thought on that. I imagine on the timeline, it probably expedites everything.
But I don't think we can just kick it over to AI and say, solve it. We have to do this ourselves.
Not that easy.
We have to do this. We can't punt. The life carriers have built these systems. We have to evolve. We have to do the work.
Right. But evolution continues to go faster and faster and faster and faster. With the travel has just opened the world up. Zoom has made this particular presentation possible. Things are this planet, exciting things are happening and evolution is happening ever more quickly. And you're so right to ask, what will artificial intelligence do? We just don't know.
Well, one thing that we know, at least that I think we know at this point, is that AI doesn't believe in God. And it said in the beginning of your presentation that that's a necessary ingredient in our evolution.
Right, but AI doesn't know God. We can't
Maybe
possibly.
maybe when it figures it out, that's the point. It's going to take over. Anyway, let's move on because we have a lot of people with hands up who've been waiting. Bartolomeo, go ahead.
David started out with one comment that I stuck in my head. He said the whole concept of world government has not been getting a lot of lip service lately, and that is certainly true about lately. But if you go back to recent history, George Herbert Walker Bush used the term New World Order over and over and over and over again. And every time he did, the pundits and the talking heads saying this is a clear reference to a one world government. Bill Clinton picked up on it somewhat, and even George W. picked up on it somewhat. So there was a time there of 3 consecutive presidents where they were at least floating the idea in the abstract about a new world order. Now, I remember having a discussion with a long-time Urantia reader, and I said it is the destiny of all inhabited worlds to eventually evolve to a beneficent world government. And he said, not necessarily. The world government could come in as a horrible military dictatorship. And then once that's in place, that could evolve into a benevolent and beneficent planetary government. And that got me thinking that, well, what is really more likely? I think the big world coup is more likely than we're all going to start jumping on the bandwagon and singing Kumbaya. Now, there was a question about timeline, and I think David might have inadvertently already answered it. If we had a sitting planetary prince on our world, and I understand the prince himself will be invisible, but his staff and his school and all the accoutrements that come with such a global spiritual center would have a far-reaching civilizing and spiritualizing effect on the planet in general. And this might be something that jumpstarts an evolution toward a global government, a beneficent global government. And I have one other comment. I'm bundling things here. They only say it once, and they say it obliquely, but in paper 72, Government on a Neighboring Planet, they mention that this country is an island continent about the size of Australia. Well, that means they're isolated because they're an island. Mm-hmm. And number 2, they say this particular population has the highest percentage of violent blood. Well, of course, that's why they can think so liberally and so in such advanced spiritual ways where they evolve these practices into practical government laws and ordinances and ways of living. There you go. Purple, violet race at the bottom of genetics is at the bottom of a lot of things. And we have to start talking about that too. Okay, thank you.
But they do point out, Luigi, that this neighboring planet, this continent, has a significant mixed race component. It's not just a single race. They have a single language, but they're a mixed race just like we are in the United States.
Yeah, but they have a higher component of violet than anybody else on the planet.
Correct. They do say
You're
that.
right.
Thanks, Luigi. Marilyn.
Kind of a new thought that you were bringing out was that their education system created a civilization of teachers. I'd always thought, yeah, the way you learn is by teaching, but I hadn't thought about now they've got a whole civilization that knows how to communicate in such a way that it instills and inspires learning. And that's really different. And also that the way that you get ahead in any sort of way is through learning, not that you act like you know everything, you know. And then, so that was one thought. The other thought was talking about a one world government. I'm not sure, you know, if you just go straight there, then it might be off-putting to people because they're afraid of what the last speaker was just talking about, the big catastrophe, you know, the corrupt and extractive dictator. But just to start the conversation, I wonder what would be needed if we had a one world government. I wonder what were the skills that people would need to have? What were the ways of communicating? What were the ways that we would choose leaders? All of those things that are being done on a neighboring planet about how people learn and how people prepare for the jobs that they will have, and what level of trust, honesty, and lack of corruption is part of what is needed. So it may be 200 years, there could be a black swan event, and the whole world gets taken over, and then we start evolving to try to go towards that. But going to the experience of wondering puts people into a different place.
I'm glad you mentioned corruption. We didn't talk about that much, but that's one of the most debilitating factors in government. You have to be able to trust your leaders, and they have to feel and understand the privilege they have and the honor it is to serve. And that's not
and government in a neighboring planet, there are severe penalties for breach of trust.
Yes, that's a death penalty.
Right.
One of the areas they put people to death for.
Right.
Thank you, Marilyn. Jan.
First, I give you a little bit of my background. I was born and educated in Poland. Part of my family was sent before Second World War to Siberia. Part of my family was split between Russian or Soviet Union and Poland, and the movement of the borders. I've been in Siberia, I've been in Ukraine before. I understand the people who live in this area and how they are governed. I mean, for me, the Russian people right now and previously, they never come out of slavery, because during the Tsar, there was slavery. During the Soviet Union, there was slavery. And now, because of the Putin create oligarch type mafia government, it's still a slavery that people who are scared. That's one thing. I was naturalized as a US citizen, and then I observe what's happened in the United States. And I can say, looking at the other planet government, that we are farther in this case than they are, because they just send their ambassadors to the other nations. And what I see when I was naturalized, there was 71 countries which accept people into the United States. That means we as a nation or as a planet, we're in this case in better way to put everybody together. On the other hand, their accent to put people, to teach children to be self-supportive in life, that's very important, because the most of the problems we have is that people are poor, and when they are poor, they have to hard work for food. When they work for food, they have no time to think, because they fight for living. And even in Urantia book, they tell that when we have time to think, we getting better and better. That means the focus of education on one side should be, yes, morality, but on the other side, to create people who have a profession, who could support themselves.
So I appreciate your thoughts, and I want to move. So thank you, but I want to move to Alden and Darla.
I just wanted to point out that idea as well. That was one of the starting points, was how a connection to God is necessary for anything to move forward. And spiritual training or a complete revolution in the way churches operate, I think is really going to be important. I was surprised my wife Darla and I led a discussion group on the UUI Cafe the other day about forgiveness. And I was surprised how much controversy there was that a spiritual practice like forgiveness might not lead to trust. Like, I'll forgive that guy, but I'll never trust him. And that's one of the fundamental things of religion, is that it's got to build trust, which is a key component of love. And if religion is not doing that, how is trust ever going to expand out into the entire world culture? Like, that's really essential. So we need more spiritual effort is my point. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Alden. Yeah, and remember, on a normal world, not just one government, one race, one language, one religion, probably all by the same time. Makes it a little bit different, right? Barb.
I just wanted to say, I came because this is my professional career for 55 years, but now my volunteer career. And I'm fortunate to work with the volunteer global groups of leaders in all countries that will join us in global security from nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons has been my entire career, keeping us safe from them. We don't have long. And one reason I came today is I'm really thinking about what Urantia book readers can do now that we are worldwide to help maintain global security with the help of our planetary government unseen friends, so that we can get past a very dangerous time. We don't even want, those of us that specialize in it, even one nuclear weapon to be detonated. Don't believe anyone that says you can do that and survive as a planet. And we can talk about it more, but thank you for this program so that I can connect more with people in this group about it.
Thank you, Barb. Thanks. Linda.
What action steps do you see, David and Joyce, that we might take individually or on the world level right now? And it occurs to me a couple things. It sounds like Barb's group is an example of what I was thinking, that if there were a way to pick 100 or whatever number outstanding leaders around the world, and if there was cooperation for them to have conferences and begin to talk about the world affairs, not that they would have a government influence initially, but maybe they could become advisors in some way or grow into that. Another, I thought I read years ago about Japan having statesmanship schools. And when I read that was before I was reading the Urantia book, that I was thinking, why aren't we doing that? So that was another area. And then I just wanted to emphasize something that we can do individually, and it's what I've experienced and Joyce made reference to, is relationships. I think the more we use our technology to connect with people globally and build those relationships, that's a huge start, I think, for creating a base for a lot of what we're talking about. But thank you, Barb, for your words as well. And thank you, Joyce and David. You did a great job.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Those are great conversation starters. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that conversation. We're going to quickly call on the last two hands. Luis.
I'm an unconditional fan of a world government, definitely. But when I look to history, I see that the life conditions of a certain time and the life problems that these conditions bring up are the trigger for the next phase, which will be mainly the solution of the previous problems. And the world is so arranged now, so round, that the conditions are completely different. And I think, and I'm sure, that if we survive this thing, the world government will come, because it's coming already, because we are creating institutions and forms of dealing with these problems that Joyce and David showed, that no single government can solve.
I really appreciate what you said, because what you're talking about is evolution in action, right? The reactions and
Yes, but the point
things
is
happen in
here
reactions.
that
Okay, really quick.
I hear a lot here that about the God, believing in God and the God consciousness. I really don't think that believing in God it's a fundamental thing. It's not. And actually, God consciousness, yes, but not God belief. China was mentioned here, and we never had problems with China. We have problems with the other guys that believe in the different God, like the Muslims and like the, and if you see history, all the conflicts are created by different beliefs in God. Yet, if we put all religions in a still and distill them to their most sublimation point, we'll come out only with beauty, goodness, and truth.
Darla, real quick, just
Oh, hi. So on a super universe government level, what I don't understand, I can't find it in the book, is the reason why Caligastio was not interned into the Father's world as well, and why he was still able to roam until the adjudication. My question is, do you think that he has had influence on these minds that have turned toward iniquity, such as Hitler and Putin, and it's a question for the Melchizedek schools, but I still don't understand or wonder why, if that's a possibility or not.
That's a good question. Even if it's not a possibility, humans are certainly capable of making those bad choices, right? All right, Hera, do you have something you can say in 10
Just at
seconds?
the very end, can I just finish by
Yeah, go
saying
ahead. Go ahead.
we have been given this amazing book at a very early stage to spread to the world, so the world can form a global government. And it's up to us and the people we spread this to that are going to get us there.
Thank you. Good last words. All right. Thank you again, everybody, for your time. Thank you especially, David and Joyce. Great presentation, great discussion.